Hi, everybody. We wanted to introduce our podcast where we'll be discussing our final project. So, our final project, we're calling it East Asian Fantasy, Animation, and Imagination, an Avenue for Transcendence. We're going to all introduce ourselves and then we can get started. So, I'm Jill, and I'll be moderating.
I'm Maxine. I covered animation in Korea and Japan.
I'm Trom. I covered fantasy in Japan.
I am Shirley. For this project, I mainly did research on Chinese animation.
I'm Jill. I did most of my research on fantasy in China. So, first thing we're going to do is we're just going to do a little roundtable and everyone's going to go ahead and present their findings.
Yeah, so I can go first. I mostly compared and contrasted Japan and Korea. Japanese animation has become a really big sort of global phenomenon. Korean animation has not really taken off in the same way. And I think many people might not know this, but Korea actually has a super big animation industry. It's just that most of the projects are collaboration projects with foreign companies, so they're not really marketed as Korean films. And I think a big part of Japanese animation success is that from the get-go, early animators really targeted adult and older audiences. So they were able to express a lot of cultural and historical symbols in their animation early on. And Korea really sort of struggled to find that same widespread mainstream audience and has mostly still remained a children's medium even till today. And for that reason, I think Japanese animation also receives a lot more investment, both domestically and from overseas, which has also contributed a lot to its success.
In just Japan specifically, there's a word called isekai, which means different world or other world. And it is a word that refers to a genre of speculative fiction, portal fantasy, and science fiction, a storyline where there's a displaced person or displaced people who are transported to and have to survive in another world, such as a fantasy world, a virtual world, or a parallel universe. But one main trope that continued to recur in my research was this trope of a powerful protagonist or chosen hero who's always able to beat most people in this other world that he or she is put into by fighting, which allows the audience to learn about the new world at the same pace as the protagonist over the course of their quests or their lifetime. And in Japanese culture, isekai are often separated into two types of isekai. The first is isekai teni, which refers to storylines where the character would transition into another world. And the other is isekai tensei, where the character would reincarnate into another world. Paul Price, in one of his essays called A Survey of the Story Elements of Isekai Manga, did this a little bit differently, where he argued for four kinds of isekai: the portal quest, where the protagonist enters the isekai via some kind of portal; the immersive, where no such portal exists and all the action takes place in the other world; the intrusion, which are akin to reverse isekai, in which the fantastic enters the real world; and the liminal, where the portal becomes a liminal space where the real world and the isekai mix.
Okay, so I can briefly go over the general context of animation in China in chronological order. First, I think I want to talk about the state sponsorship. So after the founding of the PRC in 1949 and before the Cultural Revolution in 1966, the development of animation industry in China was largely state-sponsored. The Ministry of Culture established the Changchun Film Studio and Shanghai Animation Film Studio, making them two major headquarters of animation production in China. And the government provided financial resources, grouped all the outstanding animators together, and initiated a hands-off policy, allowing the artists to focus on creative experimentations without any pressure. And later, because of the Cultural Revolution from 1965 to 1973, animators were banished to rural settings, made to work at menial farm jobs and do self-criticism during the Cultural Revolution. So during this time, animation was mainly produced for propaganda, characterized by lower quality and more realistic style. And then the Chinese animation entered the stage two, where the market economy started and the reorganization started. When the planned economy of China began to dismantle in recent years, and Chinese animations changed drastically as studios scrambled to support themselves. They sped up production to satisfy the television market and seek global market for their own works. The secure position broke down as Chinese animation was criticized as falling further behind market demands. Yeah, I can talk more about later.
All right. And then so I'll wrap up with talking a bit more about the context of fantasy in China. So even though right now we may think of fantasy as this very Hollywood, this very theatrical, very, manufactured genre, fantasy has existed in China as folklore for hundreds and literally thousands of years. Because it's always existed within Chinese history, it's been able to really absorb everything that's happened throughout the course of this Chinese history. And so we've had these stories really develop in written form at first during the Warring period, and they really developed during the Han Dynasty. Buddhism as it traveled from other parts of Asia into China, Taoism, and of course Confucianism. And so this cross-pollination of other Asian religions have really influenced Chinese folk religion, and in turn that's really affected fantasy. For example, one of the most famous Chinese fantasy stories ever, Journey to the West, has really strong Buddhist themes in that Buddha is literally a character in the story, right? But it's also not particularly religious in nature. Of course, after the Cultural Revolution, there were attempts to shed these quote unquote old Chinese stories as well as other traditional Chinese things. But one of the great things about a story, especially one that everybody knows, is you can't ever really get rid of it. And so by 1980, a lot of studios had started creating what are called 娱乐片, which is essentially an entertainment movie or a fun movie. And as a result, in the modern day, these foreign fantasy films do really well in box office in China. So Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, these absolutely crush in the Chinese market. And domestic Chinese fantasy films also do really well in the Chinese market as well. And one of the theories or understandings we can see this through is because fantasy is one of those genres with less of a cultural odor than perhaps other Chinese genres. I'll leave off with that for now so we can talk about that more a little bit later. But thanks everybody for going ahead and presenting our main findings. I also want to pose or introduce our main primary question that's really guided us throughout this project, which is why are fantasy and animation even important in helping us understand our own reality and expand our understanding of East Asia specifically? Yeah.
When I was hearing what you were sharing about fantasy in China, Jill, I found it really interesting because I was really drawn to kind of some of the commonalities that existed between China and Japan. For instance, the roots in folklore, as well as kind of the interaction with the nation's agenda, or a stronger word is propaganda, but it doesn't necessarily always come off that way. And I think maybe that's a good point for us to start off in terms of exploring this reflection of nations' agendas within fantasy and animation.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a really good point, right? Because one of the main or maybe only things I really knew about this topic before I did any research on it was I was very aware that anime in particular started off, or even if it didn't start off this way, has become this way. It's become a way for Japan to really exert its cultural soft power in the Western spheres. And it's been really successful at doing that, right? And I think this also kind of has to go back into that idea of that animation and fantasy are much more culturally odorless than perhaps other genres or other media. I think what you're saying about the Japanese folk kind of tradition of linking fantasy with folk, Demon Slayer as like an anime where it's not very traditionally Japanese, I would say, in terms of the storyline, but there are a lot of really Japanese elements and it draws a lot from traditional Japanese elements, in the same way that I would say something like, I don't know, Mulan is obviously a very like culturally resonant story, right? But it was able to be co-opted by Disney, a very Western production company, because they're able to kind of turn it into a Disney fantasy story through animation. Because when you watch the story, even though obviously there are very Chinese elements in it, there's also Mushu, a talking dragon who's voiced by Eddie Murphy. You know, nothing about that is, except for maybe the dragon, is very Chinese, but yet Western audiences are still able to relate and understand what this icon is. So I think that totally makes sense to me. What do you guys think?
No, yeah, I agree with you on so many fronts, Jill. And I mean, just to go back to what I was talking about the main trope of Japanese fantasy being, you know, always having a powerful chosen hero who would be able to beat most people in the other world by fighting. That, you know, that doesn't necessarily directly refer to Japan, but there is something to be said there for the history of Japanese imperialism, especially in World War II. And so I do think that fantasy unconsciously or indirectly speaks about that culture or that nation in one way or another. What do you guys think, Maxine and Shirley, in terms of on the more animation front, I guess?
Yeah, I kind of want to expand upon the idea of being culturally odorless. So do think there is this aspect of like culture that the government in particular might be interested in promoting. I think especially with like the Hallyu wave, and as Shirley mentioned, like the Chinese government has put a lot of investment into animation. So like I do agree that animation and fantasy as a medium is less culturally offensive in any way, but there's still like a lot of traditional aspects is intentionally included. So I think it's about like what aspects of our country might we want to promote and like what aspects might we not promote. And I do think amongst K-pop fans and certain anime fans, especially younger ones, a lot of them have this idealized vision of Korea and Japan. And I think the conscious choosing of elements to include in animation might play a role in that.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point, right? That in fantasy and animation, it might be easier to kind of pick and choose which parts of your culture to highlight. And I definitely see what you're saying with a lot of younger fans, maybe particularly Western fans or fans of K-pop or anime or all these East Asian cultural exports that haven't actually interacted with the country, where they have this very idealized form of this country as a direct result of what the government is picking and choosing. I totally get that.
Yeah, and I just want to add on to Jill's example on Mulan. Like, I think Mulan is like obviously a movie that critiques on like gender norms, and so I just wanted to point out a takeaway from my research. So I think that the fanscape in anime not only constitutes a source of escape from the constraint of everyday reality, but also like kind of provides a tool to produce like critical distance and induce reflection on cultural and social norms. For example, anime and fantasy have the power to blur some real life boundaries, for example, like between gender, ethnicity, culture, and society, and etc. Sometimes by utilizing non-realistic drawing styles, unusual angles, and a complex like intertwining of texts and like images. So I think sometimes fantasy and anime can challenge our taken for granted ideas and reshape our perceptions. So I think that's one of the pro of fantasy and animation.
I think that's such a good point too, because like you said, Mulan is able to really challenge gender tropes. I think this kind of brings me to a next point I wanted to touch upon in our findings, and just a general theme in our findings, is that animation and fantasy are both very transcendent forms of media and storytelling, right? In the way that in fantasy, anything can happen, right? You can be whoever, you can be whatever. There's no difference between animals and people. Like, things don't have to follow the laws of physics. And in the same way, in animation, you can make anything happen that you can't really, you know, even with CGI and everything, sometimes CGI is not enough. I think we see that with a lot of Western animation about how, for example, what's it called? What's the Spider-Man movie called? Into the Spider-Verse. It was really applauded by a lot of film critics because it's able to use that form of animation to really bring that storytelling up to another level, because you can do so much with animation that you can't do even with the best CGI. And I think you really see that in East Asian animation, right? For example, I think, Maxine, you might be able to talk on this a little bit more, but we talked about in one of our recitations how they're trying to remake a bunch of these animes into live action. But in that process, they really lose so much of the like magic of the anime, right? I've really only seen a couple, but I've seen like Attack on Titan. I can't imagine them doing that in real life form without absolutely ruining it, because there's so much with the special effects, the way they move through the air, all of that. I think that would absolutely be lost in translation from going from animation to real form.
Yeah, I can actually talk about that a little bit as well. So I think we all know Studio Ghibli is pretty known for their hand-drawn animation styles. More recently, I think Hayao Miyazaki's son has sort of taken over the studio from his father, and they released a 3D animated movie. And it was a good movie, but people said that it didn't have like the same Ghibli magic that Studio Ghibli films typically have. So I do think there is this element of like 2D animation specifically. I don't know if it's like the organic movement or just the art style that like lends itself to a certain type of storytelling. I do think there is pressure for animation studios to sort of copy the Pixar, Disney 3D CGI animation style. But also when films like Into the Spider-Verse break away from that, they do get a lot of praise for it because they're fully utilizing sort of all that the animation styles can offer.
I think then, like, beyond, allowing us to kind of learn about animation and how that and fantasy, how they reflect upon East Asia, it also reflect upon the interaction of East Asia with the rest of the world, especially with the quote unquote the Western, cinema culture, in terms of the pressure to live up to Hollywood standards and the Hollywood appropriation of almost East Asian animation styles, etc. And I mean, I think that theme is not only common or does not only exist within animation, but within just film in general, right? So I think it's interesting that also came out in kind of our exploration.
Yeah, I think that point you made, Maxine, about there's a lot more pressure to move into that like 3D Pixar-y style. I was thinking a lot about that as I was actually doing some research into Chinese fantasy. Obviously, I focus more on fantasy, so I didn't get too much into animation. But what I did notice is that even though a lot of Japanese studios have kind of retained that 2D look, a lot of Chinese studios actually prefer that 3D pixely look. And I do wonder if it's just because, as technology has evolved, that's been the preferred big Hollywood look and that it sells more tickets. And I think that kind of goes back to our original point, right? Thinking about animation not just as what it says about the country, but it says about that country's relationship to the world. That for China, animation and fantasy are ways of exerting their own power and showing to the domestic audience that, hey, like, we're on top of our things, we can do everything as well as all these other countries. And for the outside world, it's a way of showing, hey, we are able to create products and movies that are marketable and also culturally salient. So I think that's a really interesting point you brought there.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that. Just to like add in some observations, I think some of the really well-known recent 3D Chinese animations have also been really strongly rooted in Chinese culture, like Ne on Netflix, with like I think the child and like his rings is also a really culturally significant symbol. So I do think that there is this focus on maybe soft power or bringing really strong elements of Chinese storytelling to a global platform, especially with like how popular streaming platforms are these days.
Yeah. And I think this is something also interesting for us to kind of think about, is that even though we've kind of said as a blanket statement that animation and fantasy is somewhat like more culturally odorless than perhaps other forms of media or other genres, that cultural odor also differs across these countries and across purposes. For example, something like an animation based on Legend of the White Snake, I think there is more of a cultural odor to that than like what I mentioned before, Attack on Titan, which is set in this like fantasy world. They're all vaguely European, right? Like there's not really anything Japanese about the actual land or the people that they live in. So I think, again, definitely a variation of cultural odor across these mediums, across these countries, across purposes. And that'll kind of bring me to kind of a closing for our podcast. We talked about really two main arguments.
Just to kind of recap everything, I know we talked about how animation as a medium with the fantasy embedded has created an avenue for soft power that is more culturally odorless and internationally transcendent, making it more digestible, which allows audience to kind of investigate the nation state without feeling the limitations of the geopolitical borders. Yet at the same time, as you know, there's a reason why we use the word odorless, right? Like we can't smell it, but animation and fantasy can't help but have its feet still dug in to the nation state agenda, propaganda, culture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that idea of cultural odor and how it's allowed us to both investigate and break past the idea of the East Asian nation state. I think that's a great point, and that's definitely a theme that all of us have explored through our own research. And the movie that really brought us to this place was Spirited Away, right? And I think Spirited Away is a great example of this, how even though there are very Japanese objects, right? You have the characters, you have the bathhouses, you have just these very implicitly Japanese cultural symbols, but at the same time, the story itself and the idea of fantasy, of monsters, of coming of age, that's so culturally odorless that it's able to transcend past Japanese borders and into the American box office, where people both interact with and investigate this idea of quote unquote Japaneseness. So I think that's a great point for us to end our podcast on. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to our podcast.
We hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.